Hello, welcome to the Charity Impact Podcast, the in-depth podcast for people working in the charity sector or more broadly to achieve social impact. I'm Alex Blake, your podcast host, and I'm joined today by Alex Fox to discuss some radical alternatives to the traditional approaches to health and social care services and the way charities operate. Alex shares his experience from starting as a care assistant through to being chief executive of Shared Lives Plus and now the Mayday Trust, two really interesting charities that are both doing things differently in the sectors they work in. We talk about Alex's work in developing the asset-based area model, chairing the VCSE review, and his book, A New Health and Care System Escaping the Invisible Asylum. But it's definitely worth noting that the topics we cover apply much more broadly, so this conversation is relevant to anyone working for social change, not just those in the health and social care context. Before we start, just a quick reminder that we have a new way for you to engage with the podcast. Would you like to ask your own question of one of our upcoming guests? If you subscribe to our emails, we'll let you know who our upcoming guests are going to be, and you can submit your question to be asked on the podcast. So to subscribe, just search Charity Impact Podcast, go to our website and click the banner at the top of the page to sign up. Now let's get on with today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Alex. How are you today?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Thanks, Alex. Good to take part.
Great. I'm going to start off just asking you a little bit of background in terms of where you started in your career and maybe some of the key points that made you start to think about things in a slightly different way.
Yeah, there were definitely a couple of moments for me, I think. And so I started work as a care assistant in working residential care homes with adults with learning disabilities around Leeds and the Leeds area, North Yorkshire. That was quite a conventional sort of way of working. At the end of the closure of long stay hospitals, when people were kind of living in smaller places in the community, and there'd been a real boom in companies that were taking on those contracts. And I think at the time we felt, certainly we were taught, that it was community care, and it was all about independence, and particularly about care becoming kind of person-centered and kind of focused on people achieving goals. I did that for a few years, and then I started working with young carers, and then with in policy around family carers of all ages. And I think starting to work with families was one moment which changed things for me. It allowed me to see the system, the care and support system, from the perspective of parents and brothers and sisters and family members. And I think in my first jobs, there'd been this sense, perhaps not always spoken, that we were the professionals, and that families were sometimes sort of part of the problem because they didn't understand these new ideas that we were being trained in around behavior management, sort of managing challenging behavior. And it was when I started working with families that actually I started to see things quite differently. And it started to feel to me that actually maybe there was some blaming of families going on. And actually I was very young, had very little training, didn't really know very much. And when I moved on to a new job, it was going to be the families that were still there, and who had often been providing the best quality of life and support, sometimes with very few resources, before people had moved into paid services. So I think that sort of challenged some of the things that I'd been taught. And then what really kind of blew everything I'd been taught out of the water was stumbling across the Shared Lives sector and going to work for an organisation now called Shared Lives Plus, which was the representative body for everybody who's working in shared lives. And
Alex, sorry, just before we go on, it's probably worth just giving a brief sort of description of what Shared Lives is.
Lots of people still don't know about Shared Lives. It's a regulated care sector. There's a service in every area of the country now, pretty much. There's hardly any gaps. And it involves people becoming approved as shared life carers. And then once they're approved by their local programme to be a shared life carer, they're then matched with an adult who needs support. And when a good match is found, the adult either visits their chosen shared life carer regularly for short breaks and day support, or they move in with them and they live as part of the family with that carer. So it's a really unusual model in adult support because shared life carers are trained and they're paid. They are professionals, but they're also just living ordinary family life. And that seems so different to me to everything that I'd remembered learning as a care assistant in residential care, which is all about keeping your professional boundaries, keeping yourself and your personal life, your home life separate. This wasn't sort of although it's small, this wasn't a tiny form of care. There are something like 10,000 shared life carers supporting about 15,000 people. And every year the regulators, the Care Quality Commission, said that it was better than all other forms of social care. So on the face of it sounded like it was risky and it was sort of doing all, you didn't have the same sort of level of kind of formality that services rely on to give them that sense of safety. And yet it was had far fewer safeguarding issues than other services, and people were basically happier. And I go and visit households, and rather than them talking about all the things we talk about in social care, which are things about sort of risk and quality and outcomes, they were talking about sort of love and fun and all the kind of messiness and ordinariness of family life, whatever that looks like in all that kind of diversity. That's why I wrote a book some years after that. It was trying to sort of get my head around how this hugely successful approach could be sort of hidden right in the middle of social care, which often isn't seen as being very successful, and why all public services weren't behaving much more like shared life carers do.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Why it seems to work so well, and it's not scaled, as you say. It's not tiny. There are thousands of shared lives carers, but it doesn't seem to have scaled, in comparison to the kind of traditional social care model. And it certainly seems instinctively like a nicer way for people to live, doesn't it? For someone with a learning disability, for example, rather than going into a residential care facility, to be living in a home with a family and being part of that sort of regular family life, instinctively certainly seems like it's going to be a better quality of life. I think, as you say, I suppose that you would imagine that the risk is around the safeguarding side, isn't it? How do you avoid the kind of potential situations where people might want to take advantage of people that are vulnerable? So presumably that's through that kind of initial process of approving the carers and then the overseeing it somehow.
Yes. So in the book, I tried to look at what is it that makes this work, and could you apply that way of thinking and acting to all kinds of particularly long-term support services. And I felt that it was partly in that recruitment. So people, when I was recruited in to be a care assistant in residential care, I had an interview. I think I met the men that I'd be working with, and then I started, and so they didn't know that much about me. And that sector often hires people pretty quickly and then loses them pretty quickly. So whereas in shared lives, there was an approval process that could take weeks or months to really get to know somebody at a much deeper level. And then having recruited people that the service could put a greater level of trust in, that then allowed them to create these roles where people were much more autonomous and much more personally responsible. But I think the other key sort of process in there was matching. So people weren't just lumped together. It wasn't ultimately up to the service who supported whom. It was about both the individual and the shared life carer and their households feeling like they were a good match, like they clicked. So people were working with people that they were comfortable with. And then I think the other sort of factor that made it work and also made it safer than some services was that it's people were out there in the community, and the model was based on the idea that people would be making friends. They wouldn't just be supported by that individual shared life carer. They often kind of became part of an extended family. They get to know people. So I just remember talking to Andy and James. So James, having lived in an epilepsy centre for quite a number of years, partly because of his health needs, he was considered to sort of have complex support needs, and there was lots of things around sort of risk in his care plan. But when he describes that period, he talks about it as being mainly just boring. He didn't do very much. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a very good quality of life. And then he moved in with Andy and his family. Andy had been a teacher, and when Andy asked him what he wanted to do, what his goals were, he said friends and a job. And the household just set about trying to achieve those two goals, really, friends and a job. And they James had lots of jobs, some voluntary work, some paid work. Him and Andy ended up starting their own social enterprise together around independent living. James had loads of friends, and I always remember Andy would say now when he's out and about in his local community without James, people always want to know where James is, and often he was busy doing something else because he had a full life. But that sense that there is lots of people looking out for you contrasted really sharply, I think, with some you get some very formal, very expensive services, but people are completely shut away. They're completely reliant on a staff team. And if that staff team goes wrong, then in that sort of institutional shut off setting, then things can go really wrong, as we've seen in some of the really horrible abuse scandals. And so there's something protective about being in a much smaller, more household family kind of setting and being out in the community.
Yeah, and I think there's a flexibility there as well, isn't there? And that those big structures have, Wednesday morning it's this type of activity, whereas in a family setting, it's what do you want to do, when do you want to do it?
And they could do they could do things that you just couldn't do in a service. So a couple of things, something that I came across once or twice was families saying things like, he's learned to ride a bike since he came to live with us. And I remember one or two families saying it was my kids that taught him. And you can't risk assess for somebody's kids teaching somebody to ride a bike.
Yeah.
But it is also, that's how most of us learn to ride a bike. We don't go on a bike riding course. Somebody teaches us and we fall off a couple of times and then we get the hang of it. And so it was freeing people up to act in that much more kind of natural way. Whereas the practice of trying to avoid risk becomes a massive risk to people in services, because we end up we're trying to keep them safe from danger, and we keep them safe from life.
And I remember when you were at Shared Lives Plus, you were involved in, I think you were leading the VCSE review in health and social care, and I can never quite remember the title of the review properly, but I know that was looking at some of those ideas around co-production and co-commissioning. Can you share some of the sort of findings around that and what you took away from that sort of process?
Yeah, you can still find the report. It's a few years ago now. It's called the Joint VCSE Review, and we produced an action plan, and it was commissioned by Department of Health and Social Care, Public Health England, NHS England, and it was produced in partnership with lots of different kinds of social enterprises and charities of all different sizes and their representatives. And it was tempting for the main message to be that councils and the NHS should give charities more money. Mm-hmm. But we also knew that wasn't going to kind of make much difference or land very well. So what we did instead, after talking to charities, was we argued for that idea that actually public money is all of our responsibility, and we should be that councils and the NHS should be sharing that responsibility for spending public money, ultimately with citizens and with communities. And in order to do that, you have to work with good voluntary and community organisations, because otherwise you miss out a whole section of the community, those people who aren't who are often labelled as sort of hard to reach, but actually who just aren't people don't go out to reach. So we talked about the need for health and care services to be co-commissioned and co-designed with two groups of people. One is the people that make the most use of those services, and the other is the groups and communities that are most excluded from those services, most likely to miss out. And we said you can't do that as a council or the NHS unless you work with voluntary and community organisations, because while there's lots of issues around the voluntary sector and equalities and inequalities, the statutory sector has no real track record of co-producing its services with those people. And it's that co-design that makes the difference, because if we carry on designing services centrally and in a top-down way and with as a one-size-fits-all, then actually we know that one size doesn't fit all. It fits those people who have the simplest and least kind of complex needs or lives, but also those people who find it easiest to go and ask for help and find help. And often those services aren't culturally appropriate and accessible. So all sorts of people miss out. And that's why we've got all of these inequalities in health and care. And, you can see that right the way through all kinds of services. Like, for instance, the huge disparity in the support you'll get and the outcomes you'll expect if you are a Black person with mental health problems as opposed to a white person. Those statistics should be really shocking, but we've just they've always been like that, and they kind of get accepted. And we said we don't need to accept that. We could do things differently.
Yeah. And that review and report was maybe 5 years or so ago now.
Yeah.
So how was that received by the sort of statutory sector at sort of local and or national level? How was that received? And obviously you put in place an action plan. It'd be interesting to sort of reflect on how that was taken forward and maybe what the sort of developments have been since then, and where you think we are now with some of that. Because I know often it's the case that some of the actions get taken up and some don't, and some they get taken so far, and then there are changes in government or changes in other external circumstances that have an impact as well. So what do you think have been the sort of developments over the last 5 years or so?
Nowhere near as much as I would have liked. So
always the case.
Yeah, I think I talked to people in some local areas, including Greater Manchester, who'd drawn on it quite heavily for their work between the statutory and voluntary sector. So that was probably the most sort of satisfying, was hearing from areas that had used that model. In terms of central government, they welcomed it. We kind of briefed the minister and Simon Stevens and all of those people, and they were warm to it. But in terms of, I guess because we were setting out quite a cultural shift. I would like to think that fed into some of the policies that, say, NHS England, has developed a whole raft of policies around public participation and empowerment. And I'd, like to think that we had some influence on that. But it's, I guess if you're not calling for a sort of a simple change in the law or some funding, a particular funding stream, it can be pretty hard to see whether what you've called for has happened. And I think that it was kind of a learning experience for me, certainly, because I felt we had these good messages that were welcomed, that had lots of sector support. And then you sort of naively expect that lots of people are going to get excited and do things. But then, of course, the machinery of government has moved on, and sometimes the government has kind of changed or moved on, and certainly, ministers come and go. So actually getting that kind of change landed is pretty hard. We also put together the recommendations for what became the Health and Wellbeing Alliance, which was a funded programme of partnership between voluntary organisations and government. Again, seemed to kind of be impactful in its way. So there was that, I guess, that was tangible. I think it would require a government that was much more kind of aligned with the voluntary sector than I think certainly the current kind of iteration of government is. There's a huge amount of scepticism about the voluntary sector, and particularly about national voluntary organisations. I think is kind of I think a real barrier to tackling some of these inequalities.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's, as you say, it's really difficult to measure what the impact has been and what the difference has been. I think, as you say, that review and a number of other sort of voices and reports and things will have been pushing for some of those sorts of changes to a more of a co-produced kind of approach to services and so on. And I think we've seen a shift. As you say, you can definitely point to things and say, yep, there have been improvements there, and maybe they've not been not gone as far as you would like, and not been taken up to the level that you like. You can always kind of see some local authorities, point to Greater Manchester, I think maybe Plymouth or another kind of case study that have done interesting work. So you see it happening, but it's not quite the kind of the complete rollout that you would like to see. Hi, please excuse this brief interruption. I'd love for more people in our sector to hear from our guests, so I'd like to ask a favour of you, please. If you're enjoying the podcast, please could you promote the show in whatever way suits you. This could be giving us a rating and following us on your podcast player, or following us and sharing posts on social media, or telling your contacts about us by email. Any of those would be a great help and greatly appreciated. And most importantly, thank you for listening. You've written and spoken about an asset-based system. So I suppose building on that work, looking at creating a new asset-based system and embedding that. And so I suppose that was covered in your book, Escaping the Invisible Asylum, but then also that paper I read, Meeting as Equals, I think, was it with NCVO and RSA? Yeah. So could you share some of that thinking with people?
Well, the publishers made me call the book A New Health and Care System as its headline, but the subtitle is Escaping the Invisible Asylum, which is the thing that I would have called it if left to my own devices, but it sounded a bit too much like a thriller and not enough like a book about service reform. The idea of this kind of invisible asylum came from this feeling that we think we've closed the workhouses and the asylums and the institutions, and that we've got these community services now. But that sort of moving from having worked in one of those community services through to seeing people do things completely differently made me feel that actually the thinking, that institutional thinking and that idea of separating people into them and us was still hugely kind of deeply woven into the way that we do public services in this country. And it was just that we were so immersed in it, it had become invisible to us. And it feels to me like we need to be able to take a step back, sort of look at things through the perspective of what we would want for ourselves and for people we love, and what a good life looks like, rather than what we think a good service looks like. And when you do that, you start to see that a lot of the things that we do to keep services running in the way that they run harms people, or it harms some people. I think most public services do a pretty good job for most people most of the time, but for lots of people, particularly those people who really kind of need a lot of support and have a lot of involvement with public services, that harm can become cumulative and it can kind of snowball. So the idea of an asset-based or strengths-based service is trying to tackle one of the things that we do wrong. So one of the things we do wrong is people are offered a service because of what they need, because of some need or problem that they have, and that's the sort of common sense there. But then services become only able to see that need or that problem, and they lose sight of the rest of the person, and that becomes a problem for the service and for that person, because then everything becomes about managing a very particular risk or issue. and it stops that person from taking charge of their own life. And this isn't about ignoring what people need, but it's about being able to see the whole person and not losing the person. And I've felt for a while that there is a kind of paradox in the way that we assess people's needs, which is the more that we understand people's needs, the less we understand their strengths. And we need to be able to see and respond to both of those things. And that's why I moved to work for Mayday Trust a little over a year ago. So Mayday Trust is an organisation that's tried to kind of embody that idea of strengths-based or asset-based working. It was a traditional support and housing organisation in the homelessness sector. But my predecessors managed to carry out a listening exercise with people in a way that allowed them to say, and for the charity to hear, that what the charity was doing wasn't working and actually had become part of the problem for people, because in theory, the services were all about moving on and transition and kind of moving off the streets and into back into kind of full citizenship. But actually, people were stuck in those services for years. And that's partly because those services were segregated. They were just for people with a particular set of needs, and they become obsessed by those people's needs and problems and by the idea that charities or services can fix people. And that was stopping people from taking charge of their own lives and sometimes just from living their own lives. So what's unusual about Mayday is, having heard those messages, is completely decided to tear up everything it was doing and start again. So it exited all of its traditional services over a number of years and looked for a way of working with people that would be strengths-based and led by the person. So over a number of years, we've developed a coaching approach called the PTS response, which combines some asset-based approaches in a way which I think is probably unique. I don't think there's any one thing that the coaches do which is unique in itself, but I think the combination is. So it starts with just forming a relationship with the person as the first goal, rather than having a set of outcomes or tasks as a first goal. And that's quite an unusual way to work. Generally, services start with an assessment and a set of goals. But our belief is that for people, particularly those people that have been kind of lost within the system or harmed by the system, actually having a different kind of relationship is the starting point for things changing. And from that allows people then to look beyond services. So there is a connecting, reconnecting and community development role for coaches and their colleagues in helping people to build a life outside of services. There's the one-to-one coaching that we sort of drew on things like sports coaching or executive coaching, building up people's confidence and skills. And then there's also a challenging and changing and co-producing something better aspect to the work. So part of our belief is that people, even those people, perhaps especially those people who are labelled as having complex needs, severe and multiple disadvantage, all of these kind of labels that people get when they've, in our view, just been let down by lots and lots of services, they're seen as being a person who has all of these problems. And part of our belief is that actually some or sometimes all of those problems are actually located in the systems around them. So that means it's not just a question of that person changing, it's a question, the systems around them have got to change. So coaches will work with people to help them try and form a different kind of relationship with lots of other services around. That could be health services or housing services. Could be about challenging things that aren't working for particular communities. So my colleague working in an area of London has been working with a group of Black women who have all had poor experiences of mental health services, where there's been a very standard offer. They've sometimes been through that offer several times, but it's just not what they need or want. So it's not helping them. It's costing the NHS lots of money each time. It's not getting them anywhere. And so what we're trying to do is help them design something that would actually meet their needs and be what they want. So it's about sort of turning that idea of who knows best on its head, being led by the person and helping people look beyond services.
And in that example, when they're trying to design a service that works for them, is that they're working with the charity to come up with something different to do, or is that influencing the NHS service to work with them in a different way?
Yeah, it's both really. So we try to be a bridge between the individual, the community, and the service system, because those people can't just ignore or kind of live completely outside of services. They are people that often that need and are in contact with services, but they need their services to be more shaped around them and with them. So the work varies enormously, and it's one of our challenges as a charity is describing what it is, because the whole point is that it's sort of different for every person. I think that idea of starting with relationships first and then going from there is kind of quite core to all of the work. But it has to be that mixture of personal change and system change. And by system change, that can be something very small and local, or even personal to that person. So it could be the way that their GP surgery treats them or thinks about them, or some kind of form that's kind of, some process that isn't working for them. But then also, so in that area of London, we're working with the ICB, the Health Board, Integrated Care Board, and with the council to try and feed the learning from those different kinds of conversations and relationships back into developing a different kind of strategy, particularly for those people that they describe as having severe and multiple disadvantage. So we draw on the human learning systems approach. We're part of that network. So human learning systems is the idea that...
Sorry, I'll just jump in just to ask a quick question before we move on to that. So the sort of influence in the service bit, I'm just interested in like the response that you get, because obviously that's the main challenge, is that those services are so rigid, and it's kind of like, you have this problem, we want you to achieve this outcome, and here's the kind of way that our service works. You're going to do X number of sessions and so on, and that's the challenge. So when you say to those service providers and commissioners, that's not working for this person, can we do this? And can your service do it in this way instead? How positive are those responses in terms of them saying, yeah, sure, we can do something else, or saying, this is the way our system works, tough. And then at that sort of strategic level, I suppose it's more nuanced, isn't it, in terms of influence in that longer term strategy and way of working. But in those sort of individual instances, what are the sort of responses that you get?
The responses we get from the services that we're in touch with around that, the person is very mixed. So on the one hand, people are under huge pressure. They often feel they're very constrained by a role which doesn't give them much leeway to do the things they'd like to do. And they are often working in environments where there's constant complaints and dissatisfaction, and people have that sort of feeling that they're not doing the job they want to do. So that's, that makes it really difficult when somebody's saying, we want to do this very differently. On the other hand, everyone knows, and most people will agree out loud that the service system doesn't work at the moment. And it's partly that's about money. Our services have been starved of money. And none of this is an argument for any further cuts. We need to invest in our public services. But we know from the last time there was a big investment in public services under Blair and Brown that some things got better and some things didn't. So some things are quite fixable with money, particularly reactive services and kind of medical services. But things which are much more embedded in social issues, complex lives, inequalities, poverty, community, those things you can't just chuck money at them and make them get better. Actually, sometimes services can even make those worse, which was essentially what people were telling us at Mayday when we decided to change what we do. So the coaches have a really difficult role in that they need to work with all of those other services and not just be somebody who's kind of shouting at people and getting frustrated and angry, but they also do need to be the kind of grit in the oyster. And I think the way we try to get through that is it's about supporting the individual we're working with to express their views, to get the results and the changes that they want. And if it can come from those individuals, that's much more powerful than it coming from us. But that can be quite long and complex work, because people have often completely lost their confidence and their sense of self if they've been sort of lost in service land for a really long time. So it's difficult work, but the changes that creates, not just for that individual, but the ways in which it can improve services for lots of other people as well make it worthwhile, because otherwise our services, particularly those that are kind of some of the most challenging, the crisis services, they're just on this endless kind of merry-go-round, or there's more and more demand, less and less ability to fix root causes, and something's got to give if we want that to improve.
Yeah, and in terms of the sort of public sector budgets, the sort of acute crisis services are the ones that are the most expensive, aren't they? So actually, although there's some requirement for investing in the system as well as changing it, actually in the longer term, it would save money, because if you can prevent those sort of crisis situations in the first place, or at least have crisis responses that work, so people are going through it once rather than continually going round on this merry-go-round, it'd actually be a lot more effective, more cost effective. But yeah, the endless challenge of getting government to invest in things now to make savings in the long term beyond the current election cycle is one of the issues, isn't it? But I cut you off to ask some detailed questions, but you were just going to go on to human learning systems. So I'd definitely love to hear some more about that.
So I think as part of a strengths-based approach, at its heart, it needs to be a learning approach at every level. So there is a simplistic version of strengths-based working which just says, we're going to try and find things that you're good at and help you to do them. But that could ignore somebody's needs, and it could just be what the organisation thinks is important. So it's got to be led by the person, and it's got to involve learning from that person. And that's true of system change as well. So we're part of the Human Learning Systems Network, and we buy into that idea that the big kind of organizational shift that we're looking for is organizations becoming learning organizations. So having learning loops where you are learning from the people that you work with and feeding that back into change at every level. So it's quite a simple idea, but it's quite a radical idea, because generally we measure public service organizations on the achievement of outcomes, for instance, and on process. And we do a lot to measure outcomes and impact, and ultimately that is what we want to be judged by. But if we are led by those measurements and whether or not somebody is achieving a particular outcome at any one time, that gets in the way of being led by that person, and it gets in the way of learning. So one of the principles that we subscribe to is the idea that, yes, we do need to know a lot. We need lots of kind of stories as well as data and insight into what's going on. But you use that data and evidence for learning and change, not for control. So I think organizations that do a lot of measuring can also often be quite micromanaging and quite controlling, because they have a set of outcomes they're measuring, and they want you to show that you're achieving those at any one time. Our belief is that you can actually, if you're learning a lot about what's changing and what the impact is, that can allow you to give people much more freedom at the front line. Because as long as we are, as an organisation, achieving those outcomes with the group of people we're working with, actually we don't need then to know or to challenge every single decision that somebody makes, or to kind of manage at the level of the day-to-day work with every individual. But that's quite a cultural shift. So it means recruiting people who are brilliant at reflection and learning, who are really curious, who don't need that kind of control because they're doing that for themselves and for each other. And it suggests moving towards self-managing teams and much less top-down power structures. So again, it comes down to that idea of recruiting people differently in order to create much more autonomous roles, and then enabling people, creating a framework for those people to work in, which enables them to achieve the outcomes and the impact, which is very different from a traditional service.
Yeah, I find this really interesting. So I think in some ways it feels like a really subtle shift, and in others quite radical, because there's a really nice term that I'm not going to remember properly from the reports from Collaborate, I'm sure, which says it's about improving rather than proving. And it's the idea of like using that evaluation work to think about the best way, to understand the difference you're making, but also to understand where you can make improvements, rather than doing evaluation for the sake of reporting back to a funder to say, here's the measurement of the impact, and kind of proving that you've done what you said you were going to do. And I think it applies to the sort of voluntary funding side of things, as well as the public service sort of funding. So it's a similar issue in the sort of grant funding and philanthropic funding environment. And I think we're seeing some of the shift in language away from sort of monitoring and proving of impact to that sort of learning and evaluation, and using it to really think about how you best meet the needs of the people you support, and ties in with the increased understanding and demand for services that are and charities, organisations that are really embedded in their community, and the term's lived experience, isn't it? Having people with lived experience involved in the design of the services, but it's the same as that kind of co-production and co-design idea that's been around for quite a long time. So it's good to see that there's more emphasis around that, I think, from the funder perspective as well.
Yeah, it is. It's as you say, it's sort of subtle and it's radical. People often focus on the mechanisms of sort of self-management, and it is very much about who you recruit and how people work. And that was the argument I made in the Mating as Equals paper, which was asking, could charities, particularly large charities, meet the people they worked with as equals, or was there always going to be this power differential that would get in the way of a really human response? And I was arguing in that how we work as charities is as important as what we do at any one time, because we can't just be calling for social change or doing things in the work that we think will improve lives for people in society. We've got to be embodying the social change that we're calling for. And there is a radicalism at the heart of, and in the history of charities, charities started off as radical organisations, I think, and that radicalism hasn't always sat easily, both with government, but also with some big charities themselves, when they've become of a size that they need to be really big businesses with kind of, lots of a real focus on kind of corporate governance. You've then got to do that in a way which doesn't lose sight of the mission. Otherwise, you just keep feeding the machine, but the machine is a good service, not a good life.
And I think there's a mix, isn't there, in terms of the sector. I think of the more radical side of the organisations that have come out of sort of either campaigning organisations or sort of grassroots-based organisations, but then there are a significant proportion as well that come more from the sort of Victorian model of philanthropy and charity, of very much saying, we're the experts and the people with money that are, helping the poor and the needy, and that, there's a lot of that still there, isn't there? And I think there's a sort of culture of needing to win the funding, in that you need to show that you're the experts and you know what you're doing and what you're doing works, and that you have this model that is effective and successful. So that sort of conflicts with that concept of being curious and learning and constantly improving and adapting, doesn't it? So I think there's that sort of culture is crept in, but as funding has become more and more competitive over the years. So I think that's one of the difficult things to overcome, isn't it? And it's that cultural bit, isn't it? And that's that sort of organisational levels. And then, as you say, it's the recruiting and supporting people into your organisation to think in a different way. The more that people can learn from the people they're working with, and have that, being on equal footing, rather than being, we're the professional experts and you're the people in need, and we know what's best for you, and shift into really having that curiosity.
Yeah, I agree. And I think our charities and our public services began with the poor laws. I mean, that's where I started the book, sort of tracing it back, this original idea of separating people between citizens and people who needed support. And there was a mixture of help and punishment in there. And I don't think we've ever fully escaped that kind of toxic mixture. It's why, an asylum is a place of safety, but also became a place of danger. for people. So, and I think this sort of shift from a focus on delivery and the new public management approaches of Blair and Brown, which essentially said if you just organise public services and charities really well and manage them really well and measure what they're doing really well, that's what's needed. We'll fund them properly and we'll manage them really well and everything will be fixed. But, and as I say, that works, I think, for most of the people most of the time. But what you tend to do is measure averages. And so you might find that on average, yes, that works for the people you're working with. You can show a so much percentage point increase. But what that hides is the people for whom it doesn't work and for whom it's actually harmful. And part of the thinking behind human learning systems, which we subscribe to, is that where people's issues and lives are complex, which, let's face it, is probably most of us, it's not a service that creates an outcome, it's a system working with that person that creates an outcome. So if it's the whole system that generates an outcome, there's no point in doing what often happens, which is saying to a often really small charity or really small project, we'll give you this money, but you've got to prove that you're going to shift the dial on this, hospital admissions or how quick, hospital discharges or some sort of big meaty target like that. But for the people they're working with, that's not an outcome that any one service, let alone a small service, is going to create. It's the system as a whole that creates that. So what can you measure instead? And the idea is that actually what you want to measure is the practice and the culture of the organization delivering it. Because if it's an organization that's good at tailoring what it does, good at learning, good at innovating, is always improving, then that's an organization that's going to be spending public money really well and as effectively, and it will be having an impact on the rest of the system. And that's actually better than a on average improvement, which hides lots of inequalities in it.
Yeah. And I think it goes without saying, but it's worth saying again that these things cost as well. There's an organisational cost to doing this sort of learning work really well, which isn't necessarily at the front line. You need some of that sort of infrastructure there to be able to do it, which again lends itself to sort of unrestricted funding from grant funders and proper levels of funding from commissioners. So it's probably always worth stating again. For people who want to find out more about some of these ideas, are there some resources you can recommend for both sort of further reading, but also anything that might help organisations that want to take some practical action in terms of whether it's the work they're doing in their services or whether it's funders wanting to find out more?
We've tried to put most of the really key foundational ideas up on the Mayday Trust website. So they are sort of there to look at, and obviously we offer lots more support to organisations behind that. But we published a model for asset-based or strengths-based areas with the Think Local Act Personal Partnership and the Social Care Institute for Excellence in November last year. So there's a paper called What Next for strengths-based areas, which sets out some of the practicalities and includes some things like the behaviour changes that you'd look for in an organisation or an area, but also looking at what a strengths-based service does differently at every stage, from through to kind of referral, assessment, planning, and then leaving services. And there's more of that in the New System Alliance. So the New System Alliance is a partnership with us at Mayday in England and our colleagues Platform, a radical mental health organisation in Wales, and Homeless Network Scotland. And then there were about 500 or 600 organisations and people who are part of the New System Alliance. Again, there's some resources there. And we're building a directory of strengths-based work to try and give people a clearer idea, particularly funders and commissioners who are attracted to this work. But it can be a confusing world, and it's ironically it's developed its own jargon, even though it's all supposed to be about kind of things being clearer and more people shaped. So we're trying to kind of bring that clarity.
Mm.
I wrote an article recently for New Local with Professor Chris Fox at Manchester University, who is also my brother, how we lost sight of the point of public services and what we can do about it. And that was setting out an argument for realigning all of our public services around strengths-based thinking that goes into some more detail. And there's an academic journal article hopefully on the way behind that as well.
Great. Okay, we'll share all of the sort of links to those resources and things on the webpage when this goes live. I think that is a good point to wrap up. Is there any final points that you wanted to share? Any asks of the listeners or anything at all?
I think we've covered plenty. I'm sure you'll need to edit all of that down a bit, and my answers are always tend towards the long-winded, so I hope you can make some use of that. But
no, I think that's really interesting. I think minor editing, and I think people will get a lot from that conversation, and certainly we'll put the resources so people that do want to get further into the detail can go away and do some reading and certainly look up some of those sort of details in those resources in terms of how to take action.
I mean, if I was going to leave one parting shot, it would be that we need to think much more deeply about power as charities, and not just about our role in challenging the power of government or councils, but actually the power that we hold ourselves. Because if you follow all of these ideas to their logical conclusion, there's a question, I think, about whether the charity governance model is the model that we will want in the future, because does it at the moment give enough ownership and power to the people, the communities that we aim to serve, and are we as representative in our teams, and also particularly in our leadership of those groups and communities that we aim to serve? So the charity of the future, you would expect to have a workforce that comes from and represents the same communities that it supports, because that's part of distributing power, is how we distribute paid work, and as well as who's in charge and who makes the decisions. So I think we are only just starting to ask ourselves those really uncomfortable questions that, might start with, why is a sector that's all about social change and equality so still so much run by people like you and I, who are middle class white men, who and why isn't there more diversity on gender and race and ethnicity, and class and poverty as well? So why is there often such a gap between the people who are looking for support and the people who are trying to offer support? And again, it all comes back to that question of, can you create organizations in which people can genuinely meet as equals?
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's something that's higher on the agenda. I know it's going to be heavily down to sample bias, but I know in a lot of the conversations I've had recently for the podcast, it's been, I suppose it was the main theme of the chat I had with Derek Bardwell. But in a number of conversations, it's come up, and definitely sample bias there. But I think looking at the sort of sector news, there's a sort of regular flow of reports and commentaries around the issue of power, and power within the sector, and diversity and inclusion within the charity sector and the way that we operate. And I suppose since both the pandemic and the George Floyd murder, I think that really raised the profile, and since then the profile seems to have stayed high. And obviously it takes a bit of time for the change to then happen after the profile has been risen, but it certainly seems that it's higher on the agenda. I don't know whether that's just because it's something I'm paying attention to, but it from looking at the sector news, it seems like it's something certainly 4 years or so ago. I don't, if you looked at the news reports and stories from 2019, I don't think it was being covered really, and now it seems to be a fairly regular occurrence that people are talking about it.
I think we've
and
had
doing work on it.
of kind of no turning back moments, where people's consciousness has been raised, and again, sort of this idea that we can be immersed in something that's wrong but not even see it, and as soon as you start to see it, it's impossible to unsee it. So I think that we could be approaching, some really radical changes, some really radical moments in our sector, which we should be excited about, because that's what we're supposed to be here for, is real change, not just managing resources well. We need to do that bit as well, but actually the thing that got us excited about joining the charity sector in most cases was real change. So let's embrace it.
Yeah, the governance question is really interesting as well. I definitely need to do a sort of governance specific episode. But yeah, I think that question of is it the governance model and structure, or is it the about who's on the board? Because obviously, the stats are terrible in terms of like 92% of trustees are white. There's most boards are all white, heavily skewed towards old white middle class or upper class men, a real lack of diversity across the sector. So is it just a case of having more diverse and inclusive boards, and the most important thing probably being about the representation being linked to the issue that the charity is working on, or is there a structural issue there in terms of that sort of board model not working for more structural reasons?
Yeah, I think certainly more representation on boards would help and would make a massive difference. But then you are still left with the challenge, particularly for organisations that have grown beyond the sort of small grassroots, that board is there to service the organisation, and the organisation has its own demands. It's legal. I'm on a board of a good, quite large service provider. And something we wrestle with as a board is how you keep that show on the road and keep, in a really difficult financial environment, whilst also finding space as a board for innovation and for ideas around social change. And it's just hard, it's difficult, which isn't to say it can't be done. And I think probably for me, the way through it, it may not be a governance change. It probably comes back to the self-managing teams idea, the idea that you can have radically devolved structures. You've still got an organisation there, but you've got a much less top-down power structure working there, which I think then changes the focus of everyone at every level.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that is now an excellent place to wrap up. That's an interesting little diversion at the end there. So thanks for your time, Alex. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Charity Impact Podcast. Please give us a rating and follow us on your podcast player or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook. And if you think this episode would be of interest to someone in your network, please do share the webpage on social media or by email.